On September 8, 1931, an EMSCO model B-3A monoplane took off from the sands of Sabashiro Beach in Japan. On board were two Southern California aviators, pilot Don Moyle and pilot-navigator Cecil Allen. They had started out on a race to be the first to complete a trans-Pacific flight from Japan to the continental United States. At stake was not only the glory of being first, but also a $25,000 prize. The takeoff was delayed on account of rain, and they had gotten into the air just days ahead of two competing American flyers. Their mission began in secrecy weeks earlier when they sailed for Japan under the guise of businessmen to throw off their rivals. The airplane they were to use was waiting for them in Tokyo, where it had been sitting for nearly a year after an earlier trans-Pacific flight had been aborted. They planned to announce their intentions to the Japanese government once they reached their destination. But they had no idea about the precarious political situation they were about to enter. Japan was 10 days away from launching an invasion of Manchuria, sending out the first ripples of the Second World War. It was only through clever negotiations involving the prize sponsor that kept the naive airmen from stirring up an international incident. In its day, a trans-Pacific flight was like a journey to the moon, and the dangers of the trip were heightened by the fact that the airplane wasn't carrying a radio, because the space it took up was needed for extra fuel. The only contact the world would have with the pilots would come from naval and Coast Guard ships that were staged along the flight path. But beyond the perils of the 4,500-mile flight, journalists reported on deeper stories involving the personal lives of the pilots. One was facing jail upon his return, and the other was running from a broken heart and a broken marriage. 70 minutes into an expected 44-hour flight, the airplane was spotted over the island of Hokkaido. After it slipped from view over the horizon, the aircraft and its two pilots vanished, and the world would be left to wonder and to wait before finding out what became of them. Our story brings us to Loma Vista Memorial Park in Fullerton, California. Back in the old Grandview lawn is a granite stone marking the Redfern family plot. The first to take up residence here was William Redfern, an area rancher and businessman. He was the second husband of Delpha Redfern, and she was his second wife. They raised 5 boys, one they had together, plus 3 from his first marriage, and 1 from hers. That boy was Cecil Allen, or Cease as he was called. He was a passionate youth whose dreams were as expansive as the sky, and in the end, they drove him to soar too close to the sun. Come fly with me and reopen a long-forgotten story about a meeting in the clouds. Cecil Allen was born in Glencoe, Oklahoma, and for reasons that are unclear, his father was out of the picture shortly after his birth. But by 1910, his mother Delpha married rancher William Redfern, who moved his new family to a citrus farm in Orange County. From an early age, Cease was possessed with ambition that reached beyond his years. Acquaintances later recalled that while he was still in grammar school, he saved enough money selling newspaper subscriptions to purchase a 5-room house. He attended Fullerton Union High School, where in his senior year he was quarterback on the football team and class vice president. Cease was a popular student, although he had a reputation for being overconfident and at times even arrogant. In the 1921 yearbook, he stated that his hobby was breaking hearts. The summer after graduation, tragedy struck the family when its patriarch was killed in a train wreck in Colorado. After settling her husband's estate, Cease's mother moved to the farmlands of Tulare County, but her eldest son had no interest in becoming a farmer. At age 18, he declared his independence, but without a father figure to emulate, the ambition he had earlier in life had turned into recklessness. In 1926, he was arrested for public intoxication. After spending 18 hours in jail, he was released without charges. He later claimed that he had been falsely imprisoned, which caused him humiliation and loss of public standing. He sued the arresting officers for $26,000 in damages, but lost the case. By 1927, the budding aviator was in love and courting Miss Mary Kelly of Los Angeles. They were married the following January, but to young Mrs. Allen's dismay, the marriage quickly soured, as her husband was staying away from home with alarming frequency. Inquiries into his absences often erupted into quarrels, until eventually he hardly came home at all. By August 1929, Mary filed for divorce on grounds of desertion. Years after leaving high school, Cecil was still in the business of breaking hearts. The following spring, Cecil, now single, was renting a room in this boarding house located in the Henninger Park neighborhood of Santa Ana. It was a short walk from Washer Wilson's, where he was selling washing machines. It was also a short distance from his newest passion, flying. In the 2 decades since Kitty Hawk, aviation was maturing from the barnstorming reputation it gained following World War I and began to show its commercial potential. It was also the age of Charles Lindberg, and new heroes from every far-flung region of the world seemed to arrive each month, and Cecil wanted to be part of the club. He answered an advertisement for flying lessons from aviation pioneer Eddie Martin, who operated his own airport just south of Santa Ana. From the moment he was among the clouds, he felt free, and the problems that appeared around every corner on the ground seemed insignificant. For the first time in his life, he knew he was right where he belonged. Early in the morning of September 9, 1931, people began collecting at Seattle's Boeing Field. They braved the rain and wind to witness history as it happened. Nearly 2 days had passed since Moyle and Allen began their trans-Pacific flight, and if everything went as planned, they would arrive around 9 a.m. All eyes strained into the gray sky, hoping to spot aviation's newest heroes the moment they broke through the clouds. A hush came over the gathering with the sound of each approaching airplane that, instead of cheers, brought murmurs of trepidation with the realization that it wasn't them. Among the people there that day was John Buffalin, a Tacoma businessman who was the financial backer of the venture and owner of the airplane. Everyone was aware that there hadn't been any sightings or word from the airplane and its flyers since it left Japanese airspace. They were also aware of how much fuel Moyle and Allen had aboard, as well as the exact moment it would run out. When that hour came and went, the day that was supposed to celebrate another triumph in aviation took on the mood of a wake. By 6 p.m. that evening, the crowd at the airfield had dispersed, while out along the Aleutian Islands, Navy and Coast Guard ships searched for any sign of the airplane. 24 hours after they were due, the pilots were almost universally referred to in the past tense, or as one journalist more eloquently wrote, they were a sacrifice to aviation. As the world waited, journalists stood vigil with Moyle and Allen's families, waiting to record their reactions the moment the news did come. Plus, it gave them time to pick up on other angles of the story, such as Don Moyle's recent drunk driving conviction and impending jail sentence. Some articles even suggested that he might not want to make it back at all. But what captured the attention of the press was the love triangle involving Cecil Allen. Soon after his disappearance, A pretty brunette came forward, identifying herself as Mary Allen, the wife of the missing flyer, and she had a marriage certificate to prove it. Reporters flocked to her, taking photographs as she waited anxiously by the radio for news. It added the human interest angle that the story required, but what sold papers was the discovery that Mary had sued her husband for divorce 2 years earlier, and that as recently as a few months previous, he'd been engaged to marry a fellow aviator. However, the story didn't end there. After securing his pilot's license, the businessman in Cecil began dreaming up ways to make his new hobby pay for itself. To do that, the charismatic washing machine salesman convinced his employer to allow him to take his second-hand biplane on sales calls across the state. And it was while on such a trip he met an energetic 20-year-old pilot named Aline Miller. She came to Los Angeles from El Paso, Texas, and caught the flying bug while still in high school. At the time, women flyers were dismissed as nothing more than an eye-catching sideshow in an otherwise male-dominated field. But Aline was one of many pioneering women, like Amelia Earhart, who was breaking through the sexist limitations of public opinion. At age 20, she was hired by the EMSCO Aircraft Corporation in Downey, California as a sales representative, and was entrusted to test their revolutionary new designs. In her spare time, she was a flight instructor who helped both men and women realize their dreams of touching the clouds. When she met Cecil Allen, she was 6 years his junior, but at the controls of an airplane, she was well advanced of him. But this did not threaten or turn off the ambitious and competitive salesman. Nor did he consider the pretty tomboy as a novelty. In fact, it was just the opposite. He was captivated by her, and for the first time in his life, he was irrevocably head over heels in love. Today, very little is known about their courtship, or whether or not it caused the breakup of Cecil's marriage. But it is believed that they became engaged sometime in the spring of 1930. Probably around the time a small article appeared in the May 17th edition of the Visalia Times-Delta newspaper. The article reported that Cecil Allen had flown all the way from Los Angeles to Exeter to be with his mother on Mother's Day. It went on to say that he was accompanied by the airplane's owner, Aline Miller, only they misreported her name as Ida. It's not difficult to imagine that the visit had the added purpose of introducing his mother to her future daughter-in-law, and to show her that he finally met someone who could save him from his reckless existence. On Sunday, March 22, 1931, Aline Miller was in good cheer, and had every reason to be, as that year was shaping up to be the most rewarding in her life. Not only did she have her wedding to look forward to, she also had become the youngest female pilot to earn a coveted transport rating, meaning she could now fly for the growing airline industry. On that morning, she was meeting up with her friend Jean Hodge for lunch at Grand Central Air Terminal in Glendale. Afterward, Aline was going to take her up in a new EMSCO mid-wing prototype designated the B-7. While they lunched, they were joined by Yvon de Villiers. De Villiers had a dubious association within the flying community. According to the 1930 census, he was an aviation advertiser, although he claimed to be a stunt flyer for the movies. But his aerial stunt work was limited to wing walking and parachute jumps, as he was never a licensed pilot. In his spare time, he liked to hang out at airfields and was acquainted with many of the local pilots, including Aline, who for some time he'd been after to take him flying. De Villiers' incessant requests had worn her down until on that day, Aline finally gave in. Before leaving, she told Jean that she'd be right back, as this was only going to be a simple joyride. A few minutes later, Jean waved at the sporty two-seater B-7 as it taxied out to the runway. Aline was in the rear pilot seat, and Duvalier was in the front seat, which was also equipped with flight controls. The pitch of the engine increased, propelling the airplane down the runway until it lifted gracefully into the air. Such beautiful, breathless flight, Jean thought as the sun glinted across its metal fuselage. The words would soon become the basis of a poem she would write for Aline. Then, inexplicably, the engine roared as the throttle was opened wide, and the nose of the airplane pitched upward, climbing sharply. When the B-7 reached an altitude of more than 300 feet, witnesses said it hung motionless on its propeller. Before Jean could wonder what was happening, she heard the engine misfire and stall. Then the airplane rolled to its left and spun into the ground at the end of the runway. When emergency crews reached the smoldering airplane, they found Aline still barely alive. She was taken by ambulance to the Glendale Emergency Hospital, where she was pronounced dead. She was 22 years old. Duvalier's crushed body was tangled inside the wreckage and had to be cut free. He was killed upon impact, just 9 days short of his 38th birthday. That afternoon, 6 months before the Pacific flight, Cecil Allen was 250 miles away on a business trip in Kingman, Arizona. When he checked into his hotel, the desk clerk handed him an urgent telegram from Los Angeles. The message was brief and direct. It said that his beloved Aline was dead. After reading it, he stood in stunned silence, barely able to comprehend what happened or how it would forever change his life. He could only think and hope that it was all a terrible mistake. Aline's funeral took place on Thursday, March 26, 1931. She was laid to rest at Calvary Cemetery, and over 20 fellow pilots showed up to pay their respects with family and friends. As would be expected, all were still reeling in disbelief that someone so vibrant and full of life could be gone so suddenly. But most of all, they needed to discuss what went wrong. The day of the crash was one of tragic irony, in that minutes later and only a few miles away there was a second fatal airplane crash involving a man and a woman. Before investigators could finish their work, newspapers hinted that the cause in both instances was that women were at the controls. In the case of Aline Miller, they matter-of-factly mentioned her transport pilot rating, ignoring how much training and testing was required to get it. They said that there was a disagreement over control of the airplane, but they didn't report that the center sticks in the front and rear seats of the B-7 were bent in opposite directions, meaning that in the moments before the crash, the disagreement over control was an all-out battle. But the most damning piece of omitted information was the testimony of a witness heard at the coroner's inquest. He said that just before the flight, Duvalier said, "I'm going to teach that little girl a thing or two about flying." Aline's friends in the aviation community defended her reputation to anyone who would listen, and one of the most outspoken was Cecil Allen. But in the minds of those closest to her, Aline was a victim of a sinister man whose petty need to prove that he was better than she killed them both. It was something that would not rest in the grave with her, but would go on to haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. A week had passed since the world lost contact with Don Moyle and Cecil Allen. For days, Navy and Coast Guard vessels patrolled the ocean along their route, chasing phantom sounds of airplanes, but failing to locate any signs of them. Eventually, they abandoned their efforts, believing there was no chance for the flyers to still be alive. One who refused to give up hope was John Buffalin. He believed that Moyle and Allen were stranded somewhere, and he financed his own search, and even arranged a flight so he could personally oversee it. However, the press was far less optimistic. While they dutifully reported on the search and rescue efforts, they also had the flyers' obituaries written and ready for publication. But until their fate could be confirmed, the media focused on what might have gone wrong. They interviewed pilot Eddie Martin, who instructed both Moyle and Allen in flying. He said that the choice of the EMSCO B-3A was not the best one, as even stripped of unnecessary weight, the airplane's 420 horsepower Pratt & Whitney Wasp motor was a gas guzzler. And of the airplane, it was noted that it was the very same one used in a failed Pan-Pacific flight attempt the previous year that was aborted due to bad weather. But Martin felt that the biggest challenge facing the pilots was themselves. He said both men were fair-weather flyers who lacked the training and experience to navigate along a dangerous and unpredictable route as they had chosen. But the angle the media remained focused on was the mental health of Cecil Allen. A close friend went on record saying that Allen was still in mourning over the death of his fiancée 6 months earlier, and that he had been deeply depressed at the outset of the flight. When the friend asked if he thought it was safe to go in his condition, Cease replied, "Without Aline, I don't care what happens to me." Papers ran the quote with a photo of the star-crossed couple whom tragedy had separated, and now, or so it seemed, tragedy had reunited. It made for a nice angle with which to tie the story up, but then on September 16th, news broke that changed everything. At 7:14 in the morning of October 5th, 1931, Clyde Pangborn and Hugh Herndon became the first aviators to conquer the Pacific Ocean when they belly-landed their airplane at Wenatchee, Washington. Hailed as the Lindbergs of the Pacific, the flyers were celebrated from one end of the country to the other. On the same day, Don Moyle and Cecil Allen lifted off from Fairbanks, Alaska, and limped towards home. When they finally landed their battered airplane in Tacoma on October 7th, it had been 1 month to the day since they began their trans-Pacific adventure. Ever since they turned up alive in Siberia, the public was eager to know what happened to them during the 8 days they were believed to have been dead. Now safely back home, Don Moyle released the following statement. On the first night out of Japan, we ran into a terrible storm. Our airspeed indicator showed we were traveling at 120 miles an hour, but the gale we were flying against was so fierce we figured our actual speed was around 30 miles an hour. We flew on through that night and into the next day, knowing that we had lost any hope of making it to Washington. It was rough going, and we were expecting any minute to be our last. Neither of us wanted to be at the controls when the crash came, so we took turns flying. I was taking a rest when Cease saw a dark spot in the fog. We didn't know for sure what it was until we flew toward it and saw that it was an island. We only had gas left for about 9 hours flying, so I took over the controls and steered toward an opening on a bluff where we could see a sort of valley. The opening in the bluff was so narrow we had to side slip in. It didn't seem possible, but we landed without a crack up. Moyle didn't identify the island, but it is likely that they landed on Medny, the smallest of the Russian Commander Islands, the westernmost in the Aleutian chain. We stayed on the island 5 days. There was no food and we were getting weaker all the time. Finally, we made a slingshot out of some rubber bands and a pair of pliers and shot 2 seagulls. Cease found some mussels when the tide was out, and we feasted until we got back enough strength to try taking off. Going back to Japan was out of the question.
Instead, we decided to try to get to Siberia. The storm was still blowing, but we started back down the valley the way we came in, hit a bump, and bounced into the air. The ship had a light load, and we kept up and slid out.
Moyle and Allen flew nearly 700 miles northeast along the Siberian coast until they came to a salmon cannery at Cape Navarin. There they met a freighter captain who spoke some English, and he allowed them to use his ship's radio to send word back home that they were still alive. The sudden arrival of the Americans made quite an impression on the workers at the cannery, who went out of their way to make their guests feel at home.
The Russians there had never seen a plane before, and they gave us the town. They fed us and gave us warm clothing, for which we were truly grateful because we had nearly frozen to death on that island. The only thing we could get for fuel was some sort of stuff they used for thinning paint, so we loaded up on that and managed to get the motor started. We flew around the village for a long time to make sure it would keep the engine going before we started for Alaska.
When a reporter asked if either of the men had been worried that they might not make it back, Moyle said the following.
Believe me, there were a few times we thought we were goners, and it makes a lot of funny thoughts go through your mind. I mean about everything that can go wrong and all. But at some point you have to make peace that whatever's going to happen is going to happen, and all you can do is keep your ship in the air as long as you can and steer towards home.
There were some who found the story difficult to believe and alleged that the flight was a hoax. But the press had crowned them the hard-luck flyers, and as the world sank deeper into the economic calamity of the Great Depression, the public preferred to see Don Moyle and Cecil Allen as underdogs, who, in failing to conquer the Pacific at a single bound, had rallied together and heroically defeated death instead. On their last night in Tacoma, Don Moyle and Cecil Allen were guests of honor at a banquet thrown for both sets of Pacific Aviators. During a toast, photographers captured an image of the pair raising a glass with Clyde Pangborn and Hugh Herndon. The press relished the juxtaposition of the conquerors of the Pacific with the hard-luck flyers. At 2:30 the next morning, Moyle and Allen took off on the final stretch of their long journey that would bring them back to Southern California. When they reached Los Angeles airspace, they were escorted into Grand Central Air Terminal by National Guard airplanes. And when they landed, thousands of well-wishers were there to welcome them home. The Japanese newspaper that sponsored the adventure sent a representative to present the duo with a check for $2,500. The money was a consolation prize, but a greater reception could not have been imagined if their trans-Pacific goal had been attained. But for the exhausted airmen, it was a bittersweet occasion. Within a few weeks, Don Moyle surrendered himself at LA's Hall of Justice to begin serving his long-delayed jail sentence. As he marked the days in his cell, he planned his next flying venture. In January of the following year, he announced that he was partnering with Cecil Allen again to go on a nonstop around-the-world flight that summer. But without financial backers, the mission never got off the ground, and Don Moyle quietly drifted away from the public eye. For Cecil Allen, returning to LA at the very place where Aline Miller had died 7 months earlier had a particularly sobering effect. Through every twist and turn of the trans-Pacific flight, the ghosts of his past were never far away. And then when he reached Alaska, he was blindsided by reports that his estranged wife had resurfaced at the very moment he went missing and was playing the part of the devoted wife in the press. It gnawed at a wound that was far from healed and compelled him to issue a polite but terse response.
With all due respect to Miss Mary Allen, who is a perfect little lady in every way, we were married in January 1928, but mutually agreed to separate a year later. While it is true that I was engaged to the late Miss Aline Miller on June 3rd of last year, the reports that I was still married at the time are patently false, and a terrible injustice that needs to be put right once and for all.
Mary Allen didn't deny that there was another woman in Cecil's life, but when asked about it, she was dismissive and never mentioned Aline Miller by name.
I am his wife, and I believe that is sufficient. There were differences between us a year ago, it is true, but that is settled. My husband and I understand each other now.
However, Cecil's announcement in the press was a slap in the face to Mary. Humiliated, she canceled a planned reunion at the airport upon his arrival. And when they finally did come together at a banquet that evening, reporters took notice of her cold behavior. When asked to comment on it, Cecil brushed it aside and said he was too tired. Mary, on the other hand, was very clear about what she was going to do next.
I'm going to divorce him. He has posed as a single man so successfully that he sees no shame in admitting he asked for another woman's hand.
Bewildered and embarrassed by the whole affair, Cecil might have wished he could trade places with his jailbird co-pilot instead of cashing in on the consolation prize of sudden fame. Delpha Redfern heard the news about her son when she turned on the radio that morning. But it only confirmed what she already knew, or at the least had been expecting. In the days leading up to that morning, she had a growing sense that something was going to happen. Something terrible. In 1935, Cecil Allen was living in Tucson, Arizona, doing what he knew how to do best, selling washing machines. The notoriety that came from the Pacific flight was great for business, but each time he had to repeat the story for customers made him wish that he and Moyle had spun in and were lost beneath the waves of the Bering Sea. What he couldn't describe to his audience was the feeling that came with knowing that his only mark in aviation history had ended in failure. Believing that his name would one day be mentioned with the same reverence as Lindberg's, he searched for ways to redeem himself. However, it would take a truly remarkable achievement, because by 1935 there were few aeronautical milestones left to conquer. The only barriers that remained were those that pushed the limits of technology and human endurance. The drive was to see which pilot could fly higher, longer, or faster, and the quest for speed was at the top of the list. The place where records were being broken was at the National Air Races in Cleveland, Ohio. Cecil had wanted to enter the races as early as 1932. That was the year Jimmy Doolittle won the Thompson Trophy race in a GBR-1 with an average speed of 252.7 miles per hour. 3 years later, the record still stood, and Cecil believed he was destined to break it. But to challenge the record, he was going to need money and the right airplane. And by 1935, he found a solution for both of those problems. He secured sponsorships from a Los Angeles-based Christian organization called the Religious Policy Association, and from a mysterious private backer known only as Mrs. CLD. He found the airplane in his very own Arizona backyard. It was the GB No. 7, a souped-up version of the model used by Doolittle. It was originally built by Granville Brothers Aviation in Springfield, Massachusetts. The high-performance planes were notorious for being difficult to fly, even by the best pilots. In later life, Jimmy Doolittle had this to say about the GB.
It was the most unforgiving airplane I ever flew. You had to fly it all the time. You didn't dare make tight turns.
Throughout their brief production run, several GBs were involved in spectacular and highly publicized crashes, earning them the reputation for being widowmakers. The No. 7 was pieced together from two earlier models that had both crashed, claiming the life of one pilot. Cecil bought the No. 7 from Dale Myers, a Tucson area pilot who modified it to surpass 300 miles per hour. Originally, Myers intended to race it himself, but had second thoughts when he became convinced it wasn't safe to fly. For Cecil, there was no fear of death. Meyer's speed claim put fresh visions in his head of winning the Thompson Trophy. Blinded by the desire to win, Cecil probably didn't notice the subtle warning within the trophy's design. It incorporated an Art Deco rendition of the mythological figure of Icarus, who became distracted by his lust for the sky and fell to earth when he strayed too close to the sun. By August 1935, the airplane now christened the Spirit of Right was ready. And whether it was his destiny to win or to die in the attempt, nothing was going to stop Cecil Allen from making his mark in history. August 30th was the first day of the 5th Annual National Air Races, and the event began with a cross-country dash from Los Angeles to Cleveland called the Bendix Derby. 8 contenders were slated to leave Union Air Terminal in Burbank on the 2,000-mile contest. Amelia Earhart was the first to take off at 12:53 a.m. She wasn't competing in the race but was going to the Nationals to support other pilots. A few of the notable flyers at Burbank that morning were Roscoe Turner, Benny Howard, and Jackie Cochran. The last scheduled for takeoff was Cecil Allen. At 2 a.m., a thick fog rolled into LA's San Fernando Valley, enveloping the runway like a shroud. It would delay the start of the race for 2 hours, but it gave Cecil and his mechanic extra time to deal with a fuel issue discovered the previous day. At 4:20 a.m., Jackie Cochran lifted into the air and was on her way. Cecil was supposed to follow her 10 minutes later, but work on the fuel tank wasn't finished. Finally, at 5:15, he climbed into the Spirit of Right's cockpit and taxied out to the runway. Before he closed the canopy, photographers captured 2 images. They would be the last photographs taken of Cecil Allen. 3 minutes later, he opened the throttle on the Wasp motor, and the GB rocketed down the runway and disappeared into the swirling mist. The 1935 Bendix Derby in the National Air Races was underway. Among the thousands of spectators at the airfield that morning was Cecil's mother, Delpha. As the GB's engine faded into the distance, she was gripped by an icy chill. Never before had she known such fear at the start of one of her son's flights. She had pleaded with him not to go, but once he had an idea in his mind, there was nothing anyone could do to change it. Turning to her youngest son, Donald, she said, "Take me home." They made the drive to Exeter in under 4 hours. Once home, Delpha switched on the radio to get an update on the race. That was when she heard the news she'd been dreading. 2 miles from the airfield, brothers Larry and Paul Dunbar, aged 14 and 11, were awakened by an approaching airplane engine. They said later that it sounded like the plane was in a power dive and coming right at them. A moment later, they heard the crash. It was so close, they said it shook their house like an earthquake. The boys found the wreckage a block away in a neighboring field. When the airplane hit, it carved a scar in the earth over 100 feet long, and pieces were scattered across the entire field. Larry and Paul ran to the shattered fuselage, and in the misty half-light of dawn they could read "The Spirit of Right" painted on the side. Through the oil-streaked canopy, they saw the motionless pilot slumped over in his seat. Within minutes, others began pouring onto the field. A few men pried open the canopy and called for help, but it was already too late. Cecil Allen's crushed body was pinned in the wreckage, where it would remain until it could be cut free with torches. An investigation revealed that Cecil had been struggling to maintain control of the airplane from the moment it left the ground. And judging by the location of the crash relative to the airfield, he He was attempting to return there. But once he realized that a crash was unavoidable, he cut the engine, hoping to prevent a fire. It was the only thing that went his way that morning, as there was no fire. When word reached the airfield, there was no mystery about what went wrong. Again and again, other pilots warned him that the number 7 was too hot to handle and would likely kill him. Furthermore, Cecil made a fatal error by installing an additional fuel tank behind the pilot's seat. He was advised by none other than Bill Munger, an engineer who worked with the Granville brothers on the GB project, that such a modification was outside of the airplane's center of gravity limitations. He practically guaranteed that he would crash. But Cecil was undaunted. Carrying extra fuel wasn't a problem on the Pacific flight, and he believed that he could compensate for any center of gravity issue at the control stick. He was more concerned with losing time making fuel stops. This was, after all, for the speed record and for history. In Bill Munger's personal photo archive, now housed at the San Diego Air and Space Museum, is an image of the smashed Spirit of Right. Typewritten in the bottom margin, Bill wrote Cecil Allen's ideal epitaph. He should have listened. In aviation, there is a maxim that goes like this: there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots. Cecil Allen was the definition of a bold pilot, but you would have to be bold to strap yourself into an unproven airplane and soar into the heavens to be the first to do something. Or maybe old pilots got that way because they were just damn lucky. Our story brings us back to where we started, at Loma Vista Cemetery. And if you know where to look, you can find many old and bold pilots. For instance, in Buena Vista Lawn No. 2 along the main entrance is Bill Barris. In 1949, he and Dick Rydell set a world record endurance flight by remaining aloft for 1,008 hours and 2 minutes, or 42 days. Newsreels captured the daring process of automobile to airplane resupply and refueling runs. The record stood for 23 weeks and 1 day. In Rose Lawn rests Marjorie Edwards, who served her country as a Women's Air Force service pilot in World War II. While on a routine training mission in Texas on June 13, 1944, the AT-6 she was flying developed engine trouble. Marjorie was killed when forced to bail out at low altitude. Back in the East Lawn is a man with an action hero name and a life to go with it. Major Jack Armstrong, United States Air Force, was a decorated fighter pilot during World War II. He flew over 30 combat missions before being shot down over Germany in 1944. He spent the remainder of the war as a guest of the Third Reich at Stalag Luft 1. A decade later, on September 3, 1954, he flew an F-86 jet fighter in Dayton, Ohio, and set a new world speed record over a 500-kilometer closed course, averaging 649.46 miles per hour. 2 days later, Major Armstrong was killed when his F-86 broke up in midair as he was attempting to top his own speed record. Cecil Allen's death got the 1935 National Air Races off to a somber start, but did not dampen the carnival atmosphere. The Bendix Derby was won by Benny Howard in an airplane that he designed and built. That same airplane was also used by Harold Newman that year to win the Thompson Trophy. It was the prize Cecil wanted most, and might have won if fate had not intervened. Cecil Allen was laid to rest on Sunday, September 1st, 1935. Among the pallbearers was Eugene Miller, the older brother of Aline. In the 4 years since her death, Cece maintained a close relationship with her family. And although he'd been with other women, it was noted that among the personal effects found on his body was a tattered photograph of his one true love. Today, the names of Golden Age pilots like Aline Miller and Cecil Allen are hardly remembered by anyone. Their exploits now seem as antique as the airplanes they flew, and the only visitors who happen upon their graves pass by without giving them a second glance. But it is of no concern to bold pilots such as they, because they are not here. The fate of their unfettered souls might best be described in the poem written by Jean Hodge in remembrance of her friend Aline.
Beautiful, breathless flight, soaring in the heavens on wings of light, a soul at last free from earthly cares flies her ship safely to thee. Our hearts are filled with grief, and while even the world dons a veil and softly weeps for her child, we should not question the one who does all things right. For who can say the flight is ended? Rather, that it has just begun and is endless.